Welcome to Politipeeps. My name is Edward Hofer, and today we are joined with Howie Hawkins. Howie is running for president as the Green Party candidate. Hello, Howie.
How you doing?
Doing fantastic. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good too.
All right, so we want to talk about issues today. We found that a lot of people, when they talk about politics, are a little more interested in talking about the candidates and their personal foibles and their charisma. But when it comes right down to it, when we elect somebody for president, it's really about the issues. So today we wanted to talk about poverty, and the Green Party has a very serious platform on poverty. In order to reduce poverty, we have instituted a minimum wage, but poverty is still a problem. What would you and the Green Party advise we do to address poverty?
To start with, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour at the federal level, and if you're a tipped worker, I think it's $2.13. It's ridiculous. And those are poverty wages right there. You can work 40 hours a week and you'll still be below the poverty line. We need to raise the minimum wage. We've been talking about 15 now for about a decade. I'm saying now 20. If you look at what the minimum wage was in 1968 and adjust it for inflation and productivity, it would be over $20 an hour. We've had inequality, and economic income inequality has been growing steadily since the 1970s. And neither of the two parties has really done anything about it. They're both of them in slightly different ways. They're a trickle-down economics parties. Let's give the rich more money. The Republicans say give them a tax break. The Republicans say give them a subsidy. The Democrats say give them a subsidy. But it's the same idea that the rich get more money and then they'll invest and create jobs. But because and this is a problem of capitalism, you often get overproduction. When things are booming, everybody builds out, and then suddenly you got more capacity, you can't sell your product, so everybody stops investing. And we're in a situation in capitalism where we build out the basic infrastructure and productive sector, so we have plenty of capacity to produce what we need. So there are no productive investment outlets to build productive assets to, more factories and more jobs. So you give the rich people more money, and they invested in financial securities, stocks and bonds and derivatives, which are basically the rights to income streams from the productive assets we already got. And those financial assets, they buy, sell, or buy back their own stock and so forth. All that does is further concentrate the wealth. And that's where we've been at. So what we've been talking about in the Green Party to deal with that, first of all, is an eco-socialist economy where workers get the full fruit of their labor, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector and cooperatives. So you have a more equitable distribution of income at the point of production in the first place. Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist, but what he's really talking about is taxing the capitalist economy to provide money for some social programs. The problem with that is concentrated wealth translates into concentrated political power. And the rich don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to pay for those programs. So they're going to resist those programs, and if they get passed, get them rolled back. So that's not a viable way of providing for those programs. So, that's why we want a democratic socialist economy. And as an immediate program, we call for an economic Bill of Rights. And this is part of our Green New Deal, because we want to link the climate action to the economic justice in order to build a coalition that will support both. And this is something that Franklin Roosevelt as president called for in his last two State of the Union addresses in 1944 and 1945, and asked Congress to enact. And the Democrats at first put it in their platforms from the 40s to the 70s pretty much. The last thing that went out was national health insurance, what today we call single-payer Medicare for all. And Clinton knocked that out of the platform when he got the nomination in 1992. And the Democrats had both houses and a Democratic president for at least one congressional cycle from every president from Truman to Obama. So they're not going to get this economic Bill of Rights done. They never have, and it's hard to believe they ever will. So that's why the Green Party's out here. And when we talk about an economic Bill of Rights, we're talking about 6 basic rights: the right to a job, the right to an income above poverty, the right to affordable housing, to comprehensive health care, to a good public education. We say from preschool through higher education, trade school, and continuing adult education at public institutions, and to a secure retirement. And so just to run back through those, we think we should have a job guarantee. The Works Progress Administration kind of program back in the during the New Deal expanded to the point where anybody who in the private sector who's willing and able to work would go to an employment office, not the unemployment office, and say, I want my job. And there'll be jobs on the shelf designed by local communities, services, and public works. And it's like the WPA, 90% funded federally, 10% locally. You want the 10% buy-in to guard against boondoggles. And most people support that. They think if you're willing and able to work, you should be able to work and pull your own weight in society. Second thing is the guaranteed income above poverty. We want to build that into the income tax structure. So when you turn in your income tax, if your income's below poverty, the government will send you a check every month to bring you back up above poverty until your circumstances change. It's a little different than the universal basic income that Yang and others are talking about, where they give everybody the same grant. We're not for that. You know, Donald Trump and Bill Gates and Zuckerberg don't deserve more money. And you give them a grant, and even if it's in the tax base, you only tax back a portion of it, and they'll get some free money that they don't need. And, you know, us working stiffs shouldn't have to pay for that. But a negative income tax works. Affordable housing for all. The private housing market has never provided affordable housing for all. The people in real estate development gear themselves toward the people who got money, not the people that don't have money. So we need to expand public housing. This time, do it the right way. Don't segregate poor people of color, isolated from public transportation and jobs and in the worst parts of the cities, but make it like they do in Europe, open to everybody. In Europe, public housing is available to professionals, blue-collar workers, single moms with no other source of income but taking care of kids, and it cross-subsidizes each development and doesn't segregate the society. We've become more segregated in housing by economic class and race than we were before World War II. And so public housing can help mitigate that. And in the meantime, and we build it out so there's enough affordable housing. And when you get a good public sector of affordable housing, then the private sector rents have to come down. That's what we've seen in Europe. You know, it's Vienna, Austria, for example, 60% of the housing is either cooperatively owned or publicly, municipally owned. And the other 40% of the market has to compete with those lower rents. So that makes the, housing affordable. In the meantime, we need, like we did during World War II when we were building arms instead of housing, and housing became scarce, rent control, federal rent control, universal rent control, because people are being pushed out. We have this huge homeless crisis, and not all those people are people with addiction, emotional, or mental problems. They are working people that just couldn't afford the damn rent. It's too high. So that's for affordable housing. Comprehensive health care, we need it publicly funded, which is to say single payer. Medicare for all type system. I prefer a national health service like they have in Britain or Costa Rica or Denmark, where the hospitals and clinics are publicly owned. The doctors work on a salary rather than fee for service. The problem with the national health insurance model is the drug companies and the healthcare providers who are maximizing their income will feed at the public trough and maximize the number of services they provide to get those fees. Whereas in a health service, what you're aiming for is good care, not maximizing your fees. So it's better at cost control. And the model also has electing health boards like we have school boards, where the consumers and the healthcare workers can administer budgets in a healthcare district, a metropolitan area or a rural area, and make sure clinics are fairly distributed, that one hospital doesn't have too many MRIs and another doesn't have enough, and control it that way. So that will help with accountability and improve delivery of services and deal with any problems with administration, which I think a lot of us have faced in the healthcare system. Public education, we believe it should be, tuition free from pre-K and child care right through to post-secondary education. It's something that, for example, we had free higher education in New York City at the City University of New York from 1848 until 1976. And then priorities changed, and they started charging tuition. And we're a richer country now, richer society. We should be able to provide a public education for everybody, and for a longer period than high school, because that's the kind of education we need today in our high-tech society. And I think people say, well, you're going to fund the liberal arts too? I say, you're damn right, because we want free citizens. We want people who are smart consumers of news and information and can't be bamboozled by politicians or media or conspiracy theories or whatever it is. And then the last thing is a secure retirement. The baby boomers are in a bind. That's my generation. Our wages stagnated. Housing costs went up. Healthcare costs went up enormously. College education for our kids went up enormously. And most of us in my generation don't have savings. We're dependent on Social Security. And that basically barely gets you to poverty, if that. So we're calling for a doubling Social Security as the solution to this retirement crisis. Everybody gets a secure retirement. And, I can talk about how you fund that, but one way is to lift the cap on the Social Security tax, which is a flat tax until now it's about $130,000. Make any money above that, all the money you make over $130,000, you don't pay Social Security tax. If they did, the current Social Security system would be funded indefinitely. So anyway, that's what we call the Economic Bill of Rights, and that is, the immediate anti-poverty program. The long run is to have a socialist economy where we have an equitable distribution of income in the first place.
That's certainly a very ambitious economic plan.
Yeah, but poverty is a pernicious problem that we've never been able to solve in this country. And these are demands. The Economic Bill of Rights, it was, Roosevelt raised it. It was picked up by the Civil Rights Movement. They said, we're moving from civil rights to human rights, by which they meant we're going to end poverty. And they put these demands forward in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. They got some academics and economists to put together a freedom budget they gave to Congress in 1966 to implement it. And as Martin Luther King said at one point, we lost the war on poverty in Vietnam. And he stuck with it and, initiated the Poor People's Campaign to bring these demands forward again in 1968. And unfortunately, we didn't do it back then. And, we need it now because the working poor are more than they were in the 60s. We still have a large poverty problem, of people that are, unemployed and living on public assistance, but we have even more people that are working and they're poor.
What is the current poverty rate? Do you know?
I think it's around 15%, and they've adopted a new measure that gives it a couple more percentages because the old poverty measure is really inadequate. It's 3 times the food budget for 3 months, basically a starvation food budget back in the 50s. And the woman that developed that, she even opposed, that becoming the poverty standard. In the mid-60s, they adjusted her budget she put together for inflation and instituted that as a federal poverty line. And food is inflated, the cost of food is inflated nowhere as fast as housing, healthcare, higher education. Plus, there are things now that we didn't have then that are basically necessities if you want to participate in this society, like access to the internet. You can't even fill out a job application with a lot of companies now without being able to go online. And we have a digital divide we got to close, which is part of our Green New Deal. When we talk about, in the Economic Bill of Rights, when we talk about free public education, actually we want to build out an internet system that everybody has access to and close these gaps in the rural areas and in the inner cities.
Poverty really is a pernicious problem. It's been a major issue for a very long time, and some people can even say that the world wars that we fought in the 20th century were an attempt to address the root causes of poverty. So it's a real serious issue. What countries do you think have come closest to solving poverty? And why do you think that they have come as close as they have?
Well, I think West European countries that have, these welfare states that provide a number of social supports, particularly Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, but they have been rolling them back. And that gets back to my point about if you don't democratize the wealth or socialize the wealth, you have a, very rich class that doesn't want to pay those taxes and they will resist these social programs. So they've had cutbacks in those programs in those European countries, but they're still a lot stronger than here. And in Europe, the poverty rates are down around 1 or 2%. And those are mostly people with other issues. They are emotionally or mentally having problems, or they're addicted to, drugs and alcohol. And so they, the system will help them deal with those problems, but some people aren't. So that's why they're poor. But otherwise, if you can't work to provide support for you, they have a better minimum wage. So if you are working, you're able to pay your bills. So, and they can do that because they're developed countries. There have been, countries in the global south that are not so developed that have tried to institute some of these programs, but they don't have the means to do it. So, solving poverty is partly a problem of production, which in the global south is still an issue. And then it's a problem of distribution within the developed countries. And like I said, Western Europe redistributes a portion of the what's created as income by high tax rates so that everybody's got a safety net. But I think a better way is to have a fair distribution in the first place so everybody working gets the full fruit of their labor. And, then there won't be a poverty problem.
You brought up an interesting point just a moment ago. Whenever I have a conversation with people about capitalism and socialism, it seems that places like Venezuela and Cuba inevitably come up. Sometimes the former Soviet Union is brought up. So you mentioned a little bit there. Could you clarify a little more why you think that Venezuela and Cuba and the former Soviet system are not good examples of socialism? Or are they?
Yeah, the former Soviet system was not democratic at all. And socialism without democracy isn't socialism. It's, state ownership and planning. You actually look at the Soviet Union. I mean, they had markets, and they had a black market, a lot of corruption. The planning system was irrational. It wasn't very effective. But it wasn't socialism because it wasn't democratic. Cuba, the same thing. They have social programs. Their healthcare system is great. Everybody gets a good education. But if you want to form an independent trade union or an organization that has a different political view than the Cuban Communist Party and its leadership, you can't do it. And that's not freedom. It's not democracy. Venezuela has been more open, and even Castro advised Hugo Chavez to keep it more open. After he died, they've closed it up some. But the other thing about Venezuela is it's a capitalist economy. It's 70% owned of the assets of the country are owned by capitalists. The media industry, and even they have to contract out for their oil industry, which is nominally publicly owned because for a lot of reasons they kind of destroyed their own, technocrats in their own PDVSA, the public oil company there. So I think all those countries originally aspired to socialism. I think they lost it early in the Soviet Union. I mean, Stalinism was, he killed all the old Bolsheviks. He, put them on trial and killed them. But it was degrading before that, in terms of workers' democracy. Cuba, their excuse is they're under threat from the United States, which is true. But I don't think that's an excuse not to allow, civil liberties and democracy. Venezuela, the same thing, and they are tightening up. But again, the United States should leave them the hell alone. It's none of our business to, install this guy Guaido in place of Maduro. That's up to the Venezuelans.
Okay, I just have one more clarifying question for you. You mentioned something about how the global South countries are not as developed as the European and Northern countries, and you indicated that there was a link to the ability to transition to socialism to the level of development of the country, or did I get that wrong?
Yeah, I wasn't saying that. I was saying the ability to provide a social safety net, with public resources is limited when your country is limited in its productive capacity. But can you develop under a socialist system where the workers have control of their labor process and they get the full fruit of their labor, and you're building co-ops instead of capitalist enterprises, and you're building a public sector that is really serving the public? A lot of these statist countries say they're building socialism. They're building crony state capitalist systems where the contracts go to relatives and or party members, and it becomes a very hierarchical system. And even if the assets are state-owned, the privileges go to a ruling class. And as we've seen, say, in China, they've privatized a lot of that sector, and it's or Russia, the top echelons of the old Communist Party became the top echelons of the new capitalist economy.
Okay, so you think that a developing country can still use socialism to become a more developed country. They just won't have as much to gain from it as an already developed country.
Well, they won't have as much wealth to distribute, but I believe they can develop faster because, as I was talking about earlier, worker co-ops are more productive than capitalist firms because the worker has an incentive to work well, get more income, and they control their own labor process. They know their skills better than their supervisors often do, and the supervisors aren't getting in the way. So that makes the firms in a developing country more productive. But the big thing is there's so much corruption in these developing countries, and because they're former colonies and the former colonial powers are still meddling in their internal affairs, because these countries have natural resources, so they have extractive economies, and these big multinationals want to get the inside track, so they're bribing people. So the corruption is not just due to their indigenous politics and culture, it's also abetted and aided by the outside former colonial powers. So, if we want to help the global South develop, we need to reform what our own companies are doing in those countries.
You paint a very optimistic picture. And for a long time, people have been pushing for socialistic reforms for well over a century. What countries do you think, if you could give us a list of 3 countries that you think are coming closest to these ideas, could you tell us who they are and why you think they're the best examples and what other countries can do to follow their examples or become better examples?
I don't think there's a nation state I would use as an example. I would use 3 regions. One is the Kerala province or state of India, where the left has had power for a long time, and they've, within their, I think they call them states in India, have developed social enterprises, public enterprises and cooperatives, and have had better social provision of things like education and healthcare than India as a whole. So Kerala is one place. Another place I would look at is the Zapatista region of, Mexico, where within those Indian communities, they have enacted and practiced socialistic principles, even at their low level of economic development. And they're very, very democratic. And a third example is one that is right now being destroyed, and that is the Rojava region of Syria, northern Syria, the Kurdish region, where they had a democratic confederation of local governments administering that area during the Syrian civil war, because the Syrian Arab army moved out and the Kurdish militias took over, and they instituted this thing, and it's committed to cooperatives and socialist economy. It's very feminist. Every leadership body has to have a woman on it. It is anti-religious sectarian and anti-ethnic chauvinism, so they are very conscious about on the councils of these assemblies that ethnic minorities have representation, and they're concerned with the ecology. I mean, they've been planting trees and, trying to reforest a lot of areas of that region. And this went on for, during the Syrian civil war. In the last few weeks, we've seen Trump. And then because ISIS attacked them and they needed U.S. help to beat back ISIS, and then they helped the U.S. defeat ISIS pretty much in Syria. Now Trump said, well, we're leaving. And he gave the green light to Turkey to go in there and take it over. And then so the Kurds went to Assad and said, we have our differences with you, but this is genocide what Turkey is doing, because they're not only pushing the Kurds out, they want to relocate a couple million Syrian Arabs who are exiled from Syria, but they're from another part of Syria. So it's population transfer. These are enormous war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then yesterday, Erdogan and Putin agreed that they would jointly administer that quote unquote safe zone. And so the Kurds are being, as they have a saying that nobody loves the Kurds but the mountains, because they live in a mountainous region of the Middle East. And that's where they're at now. But that was an experiment that I think, had socialist aspirations, and we're doing a pretty damn good job called situations of implementing it in a condition where, they're not a rich area. It's agriculturally a good area, and there are some oil fields, but they didn't have a lot of those, revenues. So those would be the 3 examples. They're more movements and efforts than, where a state has become socialist. And one problem with socialism in one state, which Stalin tried or said he was implementing, is that you're in a sea of capitalism and all the pressures of the capitalist market and the international competition that capitalism engenders, because each country's big companies enlist their militaries to get them markets and cheap labor and resources and geopolitical position, and that foments war. So socialism needs to be international in the end.
One last question then. What would you say the biggest impediment is to implementing socialism in all of these places? The number one biggest thing that's getting in the way of socialism gaining traction and ground?
I think in terms of it getting traction and ground, it is the experience of Stalinism, which was an oppressive system, and it repelled people from the socialist idea. And it wasn't socialism, but that is a legacy that we're still dealing with. Because when people think of socialism, they often think of, the state ruling everything and you not having any privacy or freedoms. I think that is probably, globally, the biggest problem in terms of when people think about their options.
Okay, well, we are out of time, so thank you very much for your input. How can people reach you if they want to find out more about your party?
My party has a website, the Green Party. It's gp.org. And my campaign website, and they can find out more about what I'm saying and what we're doing, is howiehawkins.us.
And I'm Edward Hofer with the PolitiPeeps. If you liked this video, please like it and share it on social media. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and click the bell for notifications.